As a performer, your body is there.
Hi, I'm Mad Kate, and you're listening to S.W.E.T. Sexuality, Work, Extraction, Art, Theatrics. S.W.E.T. is a series of conversations about performance and performativity of the sexual and sexualized body at work, where work is broadly defined as the labor of survival, the labor of care, creativity, and capital A art. How exactly do we define our work? And how does that work entangle and circumscribe our sexual identities, our creative lives, and the ways in which we provide care? How do we perform? Tasks, acts of care, and identities. Anchored in our always already racialized and sexualized bodies, our complex intersectionalities, these conversations are a means of relating through work to each other. I hope that they contribute to dialogues which normalize sex work and all work as deserving of respect, healthy conditions, and a living wage.
Ich habe begonnen mit einem Kunstprojekt, ein alter Ego zu erschaffen und auch eine Demilitarisierung des eigenen Körpers anzustreben. Und ich bin weit gekommen, aber ich bin immer noch dabei, sozusagen daran zu arbeiten.
Das Gespräch dieses Monats ist mit dem autodidaktischen Kunstaktivisten John Herman. Wir entschieden uns, unser Gespräch sowohl auf Englisch als auch auf Deutsch zu führen. This month's conversation is with self-taught art activist John Herman. John artistically explores themes of war and peace, visual sociology, and socio-political communication across a rich variety of media. From performances to video installations to photography, John cryptically resists the title of artist.
Dass wir erstmal irgendwie lernen, wieder Nein zu sagen. Das ist eigentlich das, was wir als Künstler in unseren Ebenen einfach auch machen können. Nicht einfach mitzumachen. Nein zum Krieg zu sagen, Nein zu den Waffen zu sagen und darum noch so ein Ja zum Frieden.
John's practice is fed by his extreme experiences of war when he was fighting as a volunteer soldier alongside global freedom movements in Africa and the Middle East. We chose to conduct our conversation in both English and German. For this English version of the podcast, I've invited along a special AI friend named Onyx who will be translating for John. Wann bist du ein arbeitender Körper geworden? When did you become a working body?
Auf die Frage ist schwer zu antworten, wenn man erstmal nicht weiß, den Parameter, was denn Arbeit ist. Ne? Und
the question is difficult to answer if you don't know the parameters of what work is, a question you also ask. There are various definitions. I used to be very much in favor of the Marxist definition, which was liberated labor or alienated labor in respect to wage labor. But that would be going too far now. I think the body is both a laboring moment and it also has a biological existence that is very far removed from what we ultimately call consciousness. Then what we have to ask is, can that already be defined as work? I think that work is very much a conscious process, and in the best case, creatively liberated. That is perhaps the ideal of how we imagine work. In the case of my body, it was, however, often the opposite. I have a military background. In my early youth, I joined leftist liberation movements, and I fought in armed struggle. It just defined my life. And I think that's been a very destructive form of work. Or rather, my body as such was designed to ultimately do its job well in that respect, in that destructiveness, very early on. And that was in the mid-'80s. Much later, in 1999, in a battle with the Turkish army where I fought on the side of the Kurds, I was wounded and lost my leg. That was actually the start of a process of a physical transformation. I suddenly no longer had a leg. I had a lot of health problems and had to deal with them somehow. And then later, I also left the active political sphere and ultimately turned to art and culture. That led to this process of moving from the destructive to the positive, towards a more of a creative process, rather than a destructive process. And ultimately, my body transformed from what it was before, a deadly weapon, into something creative. And I'm still on my way. And yes, I feel quite good about it.
Ja, und da bin ich noch auf meinem Weg und ich fühle mich ganz gut dabei.
How did this transformation happen to decide to go into this art and culture?
Diese Transformation ging eigentlich, der Körper ist wirklich ein Wunderwerk.
This transformation actually worked. The body really is a marvel of nature. I think it got used to its new situation within 3 days, finding new balance. The synapses began to form anew in order to be able to deal with the cut leg somehow. but the psyche also has to process this. It was always clear to me that you can die in battle, but I hadn't planned on the fact that I would end up as a war veteran and have to see how I deal with my disability. My body had taken on a new form. For example, I can now do certain things with one leg that others can't do with two legs. I can do certain things with one leg that others can't do with two legs. I used to enjoy running marathons, but I can't do that anymore. But I've become more flexible in many ways and can stand on one leg for half an hour or so, for example, which others can't do.
Kann zum Beispiel irgendwie eine halbe Stunde auf einem Bein stehen oder so. Ne? Das können andere nicht.
Ja, ja.
Ja, also die Transformation als solches hat einfach auch.
So the transformation also triggered a lot in my psyche. And at some point I realized I simply no longer wanted to be seen or read in this military context and started to create an alter ego, an art project, to strive for the demilitarization of my own body. And I'm still at it. I've come a long way on the ego, but I'm still working on it, so to speak, and through my performative and other works.
Can you describe this alter ego?
Das alter Ego ist das, was mit dir spricht. Im Endeffekt aber auch gleichzeitigerweise die Person, die ich als solches bin.
The alter ego is the one with whom you speak, but ultimately it is also the person that I am as such. It's an art figure. Herman is also an art figure. He is constantly working on transforming his own physical existence, or psyche, so to speak, into something creative, no longer destructive, no longer focused on being efficient at his job as a soldier of revolution or liberation. John is the name I was born with, and Herman is actually in German the man of the army. The army man, that's it. So, but they are also my real names. So it's a game, so to speak, of what I am or what I used to be and what I think I want to be. So it's like the past, present, and future in one.
Also quasi das Vergangenheit, Presence und Zukunft in einem.
Yeah. Interesting. It is a very manly man name.
Oh yes, it's very masculine. Very, very masculine.
Perhaps then I would ask you how you feel you being read in your gender affects you in your art and in your race as I assume you are read as a white man.
Yes, of course. I'm a white-skinned person.
I am a person with white skin color,
Hautfarbe.
with a Caucasian background and grew up in Europe, which implies that I am privileged because of where I grew up, in the system I grew up in. I'm also a male red person, which ultimately has its advantages due to the patriarchal structures, compared to a female red person, regardless of whether I see it differently or not. And of course I see it differently because if you stand up for liberation, then it's automatically clear that you're also against patriarchy. But that doesn't mean that you yourself aren't somehow affected by it or simply benefit from it. My sexual orientation is my own sexual orientation. I don't want to say too much about it now, just that I am ultimately at home in different worlds, despite my very masculine outward appearance. And yes, I grew up in Germany, but I also don't forget that my ancestors came from Eastern Europe, and that as a child people called me a Polish pig, which was just normal back then. All people from the East were just Polacks, weren't they? Yes, and at that time you just fought back. If someone said that, they got punched in the face, and then they didn't say it anymore. That's just how it was. And so my childhood was often full of people fighting all the time about this disparity. Nevertheless, I would still say that I was simply a very privileged person. I was when I went to Zimbabwe in the 1980s, for example, to meet people from the ANC. Of course, being the only white person gives you certain advantages, also in a military sense. That's a different story. So from their point of view, I would simply say, yes, I'm just a male person. Maybe I also have my feminine side, but in the end, maybe also in the external perception. And so it's all pretty masculine. And if you're white bread, you are what you eat.
Ja, so als Weißbrot ist man halt einfach das, was man isst, ne? Okay.
Und in deiner künstlichen Arbeit, wie triffst du mit dieser Figur als weißes Mann? Oder how are you gelesen auf der Bühne, würdest du sagen? Ja, mit deinen Beinen natürlich.
Ja, genau. Ehrlich gesagt, Kate, ist mir das vollkommen wurscht.
To be honest, Kate, I don't really care how my body is read or how it is interpreted. My body has a story to tell, and my existence has a story to tell, and it is being told, and I can't stop it at times. It's clear that if you look at it from the outside, I'm a body, so to speak, a body that has a physical impairment, so to speak, if that's the politically correct way to put it, and I've also been extra careful. Politically correct terms are often used simply to avoid having to deal with the issue. The main thing is that you've memorized it and learned it correctly and said it the right way or something. That is the disadvantage of politically correct language. It also does have its advantages, and that's exactly why I developed a format that means CrypLab, in German, crippled laboratory, which is defense. But there was also a movement in the 70s. They called themselves the Crip movement. And that was about inclusion, about visibility, and simply to say that you don't want to be hidden, but are simply part of the diversity in life. And precisely in this context, when you see a body like this, when you simply see it interacting in a way that doesn't somehow embody a normative approach, then that in itself, without there being a message behind it, is simply a symbol of diversity. If it's even consciously presented, if it's worked with, if it's even a democratic statement for a society that's liberated from oppression as much as possible, these are the dreams that come with it. But if you just kind of look at it from the outside, there's someone who doesn't have a normative body and just does their thing. And of course, that also brings with it a certain attraction, because it creates irritation. We know from art that it's precisely the creation of irritation that also causes effect. And I think that's the bridge where, even though I might not have a normative body as a viewer, I can still see myself in a non-normative body or in what it has to say, or if I even just start to deal with it, I'm already changing. And that is precisely the power of art.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you maybe describe the last performance you did so the listener has a sense of what they see when you perform?
Meine letzte Performance, die ist erst vor 3 Wochen hat die stattgefunden. Man muss dazu sagen, dass ich zum ersten Mal nach einem Jahr wegen Long-Covid, ich habe immer noch Long-Covid.
Sorry.
My last performance was only 3 weeks ago. I have to say that it was for the first time in a year because of long COVID, which I still have. Anyway, I was very excited, but I wasn't able to call up the potential that I simply had before. I don't have that at the moment. Conceptually, I had a performance that was quite intense from the time of the pandemic. It was a video performance, but it was performed live and was exhibited for 2 months in Nijmegen, Centre Culturel de Rencontre, a state museum in Luxembourg, in a video installation. It has not been shown since, but you can watch it online. It was about resilience, and the end result was that my body was cleaned for 13 minutes with this cleaning device. I think it's called a high-pressure cleaner. And that was a pretty intense and very physically challenging performance, which I implemented again. And then in another performance as part of my CrypLab format, I worked with the prostheses that I carry on my body. I confronted the audience with the prostheses with them, in a sense as co-performers, so not many people touch prostheses, nor deal with such a reality. And when you are suddenly confronted with it in such a setting, it becomes part of the process. Yes, it was very interesting to see, and I was also very happy that it somehow worked out that I managed 21 minutes, and I'm currently working on doing that again. My body, I'm such a long-durational performer. I have no idea, but my body does that. It is very, very difficult to reduce the time.
Keine Ahnung, mein Körper macht das so.
Mhm.
Es war sehr, sehr schwierig, das auch so zu reduzieren, weil der Körper mehr erzielen will. Also keine Ahnung, fast alle meine Performances sind irgendwie ab 1 Stunde und das macht der Körper selbst.
In this case, what does the prosthetic symbolize and the loaning out of the prosthetic to the people in the audience? What kind of idea were you hoping they might explore with this?
No, it's just a medium. Also es ist einfach nur ein Medium.
The prosthesis as such doesn't really matter. It is simply a medium. So if someone sees a disabled person, in other words, a person with limited physical abilities, then it's usually the case in society that they don't look at them, leave them alone. So when children who deal with it very naturally say, "Look, Mom, he doesn't have a leg," the parent says, "Don't look over there." People can perhaps visualize this from their own childhood, how people with disabilities are treated. Prostheses are part of that as a symbol of something that wasn't allowed or one couldn't deal with. And suddenly, one is confronted with it and has to see how they can somehow come to terms with it. And that becomes a collective process, as performances can sometimes be. And yes, there are people who may be afraid of it. That's okay too. There are people who just totally go for it somehow and just say, wow, and some just have a bad feeling and so on, and everyone takes part in it in whatever way they can. And I thought that was somehow very interesting to see. It's actually just a symbol of something that we weren't allowed or didn't want to deal with, and I do it anyway, and suddenly things start to change.
Do the audience members have a chance to have dialogue with you as this is happening?
Not during, because I was also involved in the performance. I also worked with a sound installation that I had already used elsewhere. I recut it, so it was a very elaborate installation. The production process was 3 weeks. And yes, it's just one that mainly focuses on the current social and general political contexts, the wars that somehow determine us. And accordingly, this sound installation was also about war and what it does to people. And that was implemented with a body that also comes from war, but deals with it constructively and approaches others and starts a process, something almost shamanistic in this form. And the dialogue with the audience then took place afterwards, and although it was quite late, everyone somehow stayed and wanted to find out something and ask something. And yes, that was somehow also very interesting, what they asked, and I was very pleased that it could have such an effect. I'll be doing the second performance October 18th in Wiesbaden. Puppets of Power, The Art of War.
Es ist in irgendeiner Kunstgalerie, es ist eine andere Performance, Puppets of Power, The Art of War.
I would love to ask you about, because you stay so much in the body, you challenge the body, to ask about this extractive nature. Wie sieht die Natur von Extractivismus? Ich weiß nicht, wie das, Extractivism von meinem eigenen Körper, also von man's, yeah.
Extraktivismus.
Extractivism. It's actually an economic term. It's an economic term that somehow represents the exploitation of resources that are naturally available. And that's why I found the term somehow quite interesting in the context of art. I wouldn't see it as exploitation, even if I'm somehow pushing my body to its limits. But you also have to say, what is the body for me in performance? First of all, it is simply a medium for me and a tool, perhaps one of the most powerful and most effective forms of expression in performance art. So the body itself has different dimensions. It can be material, it can be a driving factor, it can be passive, and I would also see it as a source of certain resources, where this term perhaps somehow fits in, but I myself don't feel exploited in the process. Even if I somehow give everything in the process, I can only talk about the feeling I get after a performance, where I'm so empty somehow, filled with such emptiness, an abysmal feeling of emptiness, where I know I've told everything, or the body has told everything. My body as a medium in this context has given everything and is ultra vulnerable, very fragile. And that's where you asked before, because the body somehow comes across as so masculine, but he's anything but that. He's fragile, he's very vulnerable, he's tender at first. So these are opposites that I like to work with, because that's what I am. And they are often opposites in one person, different factors or different beings that are somehow at odds with each other inside one person. And in performative work or performative art, that really comes to the fore. I myself can't say that I feel exploited either, but I feel very naked afterwards, very vulnerable. And on the other hand, it is also just a being which in itself we can meet. That's where I often connect with the audience. Namely because it's so honest. It's just the pure nakedness of the being, and one can see oneself in it, one can connect somehow. And that's where we come together.
Mm-hmm. And often, correct me if I'm wrong, often you are actually naked on stage. What role does this play for you to have very little costume? I find this a really interesting question when one chooses the skin as costume somehow.
That's it.
Ja, ist eine gute Sache. Also ich habe einfach angefangen, es war ein Projekt.
It was a project that I started with. When you put on a uniform in a military context, at first it's just a piece of clothing. But over time, the uniform, the thing, also becomes an inner uniform, an attitude. And that's somatic. And I didn't want to be that anymore. I no longer wanted to be this destructive being. And so I simply broke with everything I could overnight and simply chose to be naked. So I also have one or two works without uniform, where the injured, the half-destroyed and naked body performed. But even though it was destroyed, even though it no longer corresponds to the normative, no longer corresponds to this patriarchal masculine thing that a soldier is supposed to be, it can still develop its own activity, its own attraction. And precisely because it is no longer uniform, and because this was the first project that I ever did, I changed mid-career, have only been doing it for 11 years. That's actually quite a short time. On the other hand, when I look at what I've done, how I've done it, it's been a very intensive time. I had a lot of catching up to do. Let's put it that way. And yes, the nudity as such is not just that I somehow perceive as skin, but it's also a form. It's also a space. It's a performative space in which, yes, I think it's very difficult in this day and age to locate yourself, so to speak, to see where truths are, or what realities are, because it simply can't be said in black and white. You can do that, for example, in a warlike process, or sometimes with genocidal affect, like in the Gaza conflict. But there are simply no simple answers. It's not just somehow taking a side. And nudity in particular means that I simply see what I see, right? Or I can interpret something into it that I want to interpret, like a canvas. It's a space where we can meet. But I always make sure that it doesn't necessarily have a sexualized connotation or eroticized connotation. There are art forms where that is part of it, and I find those very exciting and great. But that's not the story that I want to tell or that my body wants to tell. I can simply appear different with a certain posture when I'm naked. With a certain posture, I can have a totally eroticizing effect, and I just don't do that. But what others sometimes see, it can be pretty funny. I did a performance called Blood on My Shoulders, where I was working with blood, and it was pure carnage. But a few people who watched it made some sexualizing comments. And I thought to myself, my God, really? I've created a massacre, blood splattered everywhere. So I have no idea how they got that, but I found it interesting.
Mein Gott, echt, ne? Ich habe da ein Massaker angerichtet. Also quasi, da ist das Blut gespritzt und sonstiges und die denken sozusagen nur ans Vögeln. Also keiner. Ich habe das nicht kapiert, fand es aber interessant.
Yeah.
Und habe es auch so einfach so genommen. Scheiß drauf. Also ist das.
I'd like to ask you a bit more into the question of war and how and in what ways you're engaging with this topic, because I mean, certainly it's a process, but maybe also when you go into a performance like Blood on My Shoulders, there's an idea or a concept that you would like to translate.
Okay, maybe you can also translate this word guilt on my shoulder. You know, blood on my shoulder, guilt on my shoulder, or I put guilt on my shoulder. No?
Yeah.
Also sich Schuld aufladen.
It was a very personal performance, simply about what you did in your job as a soldier of the revolution. And I've always understood that, even as a trash collector, so to speak, that you're the trash collector in such a historical process, because someone has to do the dirty work, right? And always on the basis of legitimate self-defense, and yet you do the wrong things for the right things and so on. It's simple. Ultimately, it's just that we hurt each other, and it shouldn't really be like that. And that changes people. And when I'm in this process, I just like to deal with it. And with these processes of visual sociology, for example, collecting data material, I am creating anew in order to produce new databases that I can somehow use in a collective process. That's one thing that really drives me. But also simply, yes, it's the body. The body is simply something that says something. And the body was at war for a very long time and was very efficient, and it no longer wants to be. So these are different interests, and they simply come to light in a tense relationship in a performance like this, and that's why they come to light so powerfully, perhaps somehow, without being bold. So I also like watching open source group performances where it's just about coming together, but I'm more of a conceptual performer myself, where I just work on a topic for months, deal with it, and at some point you wear it, then you're with the process. This maturing process is such that at some point the performance must be born, has to get out, like a birth. I'm not a woman, So ultimately, I can't understand what that really means. But as a metaphor, I somehow find it quite nice as a life-creating thing. It's just so simple. At some point, it has to be born. That is the performance as such. And then you have to see exactly when the time is right. So it's not just a thing where you just kind of call up a program like in a play and perform it again and again in a guest performance and so on. So I only ever do the performances once and not several times, including the theme and also the style. Maybe there are elements that crop up in one performance or another, but the theme as such is always new, unique, and yes, it simply can't be done in any other way. And that should be the case when it comes to the subject of war. Sometimes these are the things that are on your mind or where you simply deal with them. And for example, Phoenix, The Things I Never Told. It was kind of a performance that I did on my 54th birthday or so, and it was the first time I celebrated a birthday by just performing. I had collected driftwood for a week beforehand. I live in Cologne. I went to the Rhine meadows and collected pieces of wood, and then I used them in the performance and was pretty close to the water. That was on April 9th, and it was snowing, it was raining, the sun was shining, so it was really April weather. And yes, I just started writing a lot of thoughts or certain names or whatever on these pieces of wood and handing them over to the Rhine. Then somehow a big tidal wave came and took most of the wood away, and I only just managed to avoid being swept away.
Gewisse Performances sind halt sehr, sehr persönlich, ne? Die einfach eigentlich.
These kinds of performances are very personal because they have something to do with your own personal story, no?
Especially in this moment now when maybe one could say there is a bit of more mainstreaming of speaking about war and genocide, decoloniality. Perhaps one could say, I don't know if it's just inside of my own algorithm, I'm not sure. Where do you place your art specifically? And was kann Kunst oder dein Kunst, was kann Performance jetzt in diesem Moment machen? Ja, genau. Viele Leute, vielleicht viel mehr als vorher, weiß nicht, sprechen über Krieg, über Dekolonialität. Ich hoffe. Aber und was können wir jetzt als Künstlerin tun?
I think it's important to understand that we're not just seeing a succession of wars or something, but a comprehensive restructuring process that is currently taking place worldwide between the international order. Of course, it has a lot to do with the war in Ukraine, but ultimately that is not the cause. It is simply the culmination point, the point at which it broke out. The fact that it actually came to the point where Russia invaded Ukraine and more or less developed into a proxy war between NATO and Russia. It is at the same time wise to remember that an economic war has been unleashed that has never been seen before in this history, and with over 18 to 22,000 individual sanctions, and that a process has emerged that has pushed this multipolarity in their view. Russia has messed up, ultimately messed up its ambitions. And so has the West. The value-driven West, as you put it, which actually means nothing other than that they insist that the old world order continues, that they can continue to exploit, that they can continue to give orders to the African countries and the global South. And right now it's simply no longer possible because the sanctions alone are hardly being complied with in any way. So it also shows the powerlessness of the power blocks as such. And in this large framework, if we now look at the realities of our lives here in Germany, where we are right now, scenes where we have been witnessing a huge warmongering for 2.5 years, this perception that these warmongers, these bellicists who are constantly crying out for arms deliveries and so on, you can think what you like about it, but I know that weapons make no sense without diplomacy. And so the so-called value-driven West also lacks a strategy as to what it wants to do with these weapons, apart from virtually finishing off this Russia. And that's not going to happen. They've proven that. And as far as I can see now, most people have actually buried their illusions. Russia is simply a nuclear power. It's madness. They're playing with it like little children, with our future and with the future of this planet. I grew up, or you probably did too, in a world where we were still afraid of nuclear weapons. So where it was just clear that if something happens, then we're all screwed. And that can't happen. And they say, he won't do that.
Das darf nicht passieren. Und mit Leuten so, oh, das wird der nicht machen. Ich mache dies und sonstiges, das wird der nicht machen, der Putin.
I'll do this and that. He won't do that. Putin, how are they supposed to know that? These are people who simply haven't experienced these dangers, who haven't actually experienced war. And then we're doing tiny adventures. And believe me, this is it. If not the strongest nuclear power ever on this planet, you won't beat them. Before that happens, everything will fall apart. And these dreamers simply have to understand that, especially in Germany. But you can also see how dishonest and hypocritical it simply is. Western politics per se. If I just look with the reason of state and the attitude towards the genocidal actions of Israel as a reaction to people resisting it, which Hamas has somehow done, I have said that this is not an easy thing. On the one hand, there are Islamofascists, and on the other hand, Israeli fascists, and in between, civilians who have to pay for all this shit. So it's not so easy to take sides. But in the end, I am of the opinion that the genocide has to stop. That's absolutely clear. This is also covered by international policy, but that is simply being flattened here. You have to take a very differentiated approach, and the performance that you have in mind, that I have in mind, or something like that, simply deals with a more differentiated view of the fact that we first somehow learn to say no again. That's actually what we can do as artists on our own levels. Simply to be able to show people through our actions and our work that it does make sense to say no, to be a fly in the ointment, not simply to join in, and to say no to war, to say no to weapons, and then a yes to peace. As I said, there are no simple answers, but the simplest answer is that I have to see that this slaughter has to stop. And that's just simple and ultimately for life, against war. And that's nothing like that. I'm not a pacifist, not in any way. But you can still somehow be for peace or see that we don't escalate it any further, but de-escalate it and then somehow find a way. The only way is through talks. I think the SPD was better at that in the 70s and 80s under Brandt and whatnot. But okay, these are all somehow imperial interests. But Russia is not necessarily a child of sad parents, as they say. There are no friendships in national politics or anything else. There are only interests. You have to make it clear that it's in everyone's interest that certain communication processes turn from destructive to positive. And we will also have to live together with Russia again at some point in the European house. But the way they are talking at the moment, this thing, this mainstream, this warmongering mainstream, it has to stop. It has to stop. And in the end, I can say no to that. And that's what more or less people are saying. Almost 80% say no to it. And it's perverse that somehow some of those who express themselves against the war are, for example, a fascist party like the AfD. It's impossible that we would leave it to fascists, but they just say nope, let them deal with it. That does nothing for German interests, which is ultimately true.
Would you be willing to speak about how you feel about armed struggle now?
So I was always fighting alongside freedom movements, never served in an ordinary army.
But you grew up in Germany and you decided to join these freedom movements?
You know, I was believing in self-defense. I think it was in the beginning of the 80s, end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, that the fascists grown up rapidly on the streets. There was heavy street fightings with them. So we just organized ourselves in anti-fascist units, and this was militant groups, and we fought them back onto the streets. And this was just happened by accidents that no one was killed in that time so much. I think it has been happened, but we was believing in armed struggle as a tool to change the society, you know. So in that way, for me, it was quite normal, like a Che Guevara, you know, to fight in other places with that Marxist thought that you be an internationalist, you know, that it doesn't matter where you fight, it matters that you fight on the right place. That was the reason why, for me, it was quite normal. Even in my family, before the Second World War, two of them was fighting in the Spanish Civil War, so it's even older the family tradition. I don't know if it's so needed to talk about armed struggle, because it's not the question anymore. especially not in Europe. There was in a time in the 70s, 80s, it was quite normal, widespread. Not in UK, but in Belgium, in France, in Italy, in Spain. And for me, it was quite normal that revolutionary violence can be a tool in that process of liberation of a society. So, and I think today, I'm strongly believing that in the shadow of the weapons, democracy and a free society can't develop. This is something what is contradictory. Maybe you have to use that tool for defend yourself, for defend your colleague, your people, or your group, or whatever else. But as a main tool for leading processes for liberation in a society, it's not so useful because the military logic is just black and white. These are clear assumptions, and I think it's very difficult to develop democracy beneath a structure of weapon and militaristic discipline. So it's something contradictory but doesn't work out. So where the weapon speaks, dictatorship is always near. It's quite normal. So, but sometimes you need the weapons to defend yourself. That's it. So.
Yeah, I find this topic really fascinating. I was listening to a podcast from some anarchists recently, and they were making some really good points about how these collective struggles very easily turn into, as you say, dictatorial forms, or that power kind of pools in certain places. And I mean, I noticed this in collective organizing of protesters as well, that it was really quickly forming into some negative habits, or, structures being reformed, ideas of democracy that I guess are sort of ingrained in how decision-making processes are made, then become replicated, but are they actually effective?
For that, you just need to understand the dynamic of military processes. It's not just an army. It's about power. It's about mindset. It's about structures. It's about the communication processes. And military means that are very strict because you have commands and you have to execute that commands. So it's quite simple. And I think the democratic communication processes in a movement or in a society are much more complicated than this very simple mindset of a military process. And that's why I don't like it so much. But I'm not a dreamer in that way. I'm a realistic dreamer, and I have still dreams. And I need to keep my dreams alive because it's nice to dream. Because without dreaming, you can't push towards to new horizons of ideas. But we have to be realistic in that way. That weapons are something like a poison, what you sometimes need in very low doses. Very low doses, then maybe you can create something. But if you transform everything to that process, you will lose, last but not least. When it comes to liberation of a society, comes to liberation of a society, and that's my experience, what I got from all corners of that world with this movement we witnessed in the 70s or in the 80s. And now just a look to Nicaragua, have a look to Cuba. I think Clausewitz told for one time, with the first shot, every plan doesn't die, That means that when I do my first step into praxis, all my beautiful thoughts blow away because it's the practice. But you need these thoughts to come to this step. So I think it's a normal process. And this is very important to say, even that maybe the outcoming is not that what we expected or what we wished for. I think it's always right to fight for justice, to fight for your rights, and to defend other people who are not able to defend themselves. And this is where I think it's called solidarity. Solidarity, and this is I think, one of the most important abilities what we need as humans. And for that, we don't need Christianity or something like else or other ideologies. We need just to be humans, and we have a sense also for others. That's it.
You mentioned before you have dreams. What are some of your dreams?
I'm still believing in that dream that another world is possible under some circumstances. Also ich
I
meine,
think I'm still
das ist-
believing in the dream that another world is possible, under some circumstance. So, I mean, that's simply the dream, that somehow another world is always possible, under certain circumstances. And it's simply this positive moment when I get together with people, when I talk to them. And then we have the opportunity not to bash each other's heads in, both on the small and the large scale. And it's not the big dreams of saying I somehow want to live in freedom and I want this and so on. I can live as freely as I can, but it's still limited because we live under the influence of systems, or the way we are shaped. And yes, the dream is ultimately that we can still make it somehow. In the meantime, I suppose my dreams have become smaller, that we won't somehow destroy the globe and blow everything up. Although I'm very pessimistic in this respect. It's madness, the naivety and the greed, the simultaneous naivety and greed. These things, so to speak, are a really bad mixture, that we are living in a very, very dangerous time. And I think it should be everyone's dream to say, let's come together and not go along with this shit, no matter what.
Ich glaube, es sollte zum Traum für jeden sein, zu sagen, nee, lass uns zusammenkommen und diesen Scheiß nicht mitmachen, egal wie.
You just heard from self-taught art activist John Herman. John artistically explores themes of war and peace, visual sociology, and socio-political communication across a rich variety of media. You can read more about him and his practice in the show notes. I'm Mad Kate, and you've been listening to S.W.E.A.T, a series of conversations about performance and performativity of the sexual and sexualized body and work. The theme music was composed by me and features the voice of performer and actress Laurie Baldwin. S.W.E.A.T airs every second Tuesday of the month at 13 hours Central European Time on Collaboradio, Free Radios Berlin Brandenburg, broadcasting on 88.4 FM in Berlin, 90.7 FM in Potsdam, and streaming online at fr-bb.org. Thanks so much. Until next time.